As some of you know, we co-organize and co-sponsor every year an event in the United Kingdom together with the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, an annual look at deterrence challenges. And after a decade or so of looking at Northeast Asia and the Middle East and some comparative things, last year this annual event came back to Russia, NATO, and deterrence, essentially for the first time in a long time. And there were a number of eye-opening experiences for me at that event. One was the clarity with which people could speak about Russia's strategy for coercion and deterrence of NATO, and the lack of clarity with which we could talk about our strategy, NATO's strategy. Another thing that leapt out was the difficulty of the American audience in getting seized effectively with the questions. And to me, the chief indicator of this was, or a good example of the problem was that one of the panels was about nuclear modernization and its impact on NATO's deterrence strategy of Russia. And the two presenters spoke for a total of about 45 minutes and never mentioned Russia and never mentioned NATO. It was all about, do we need a triad or don't we need a triad? The usual dancing on the head of a pin instead of thinking through the challenge now in front of us, Russia, and what we do about it. Conspicuously, the interesting new thinking brought to that discussion at Wilton Park last spring was done by the Central and Northern Europeans. Needless to say, more galvanized with this question than a lot of other people inside the alliance. And conspicuously, that thinking was brought to the group by the younger members in the room. Not surprisingly, the think tanks of the ministries of defense in Central and Eastern Europe have been reinvesting in these capabilities for a while now in a manner in which the rest of the alliance has kind of lagged. And among the bright voices there, with bright ideas and clear and interesting things to say about Russia's strategy, was our speaker today. And we've interacted subsequently a number of times. I've heard her present on this topic most recently at a gathering of the NATO International Nuclear Staff in Oslo in the autumn. Kristin is a member of the research staff of the Norwegian Ministry of Defense think tank called the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. The Norwegian Minister of Defense is very tough on these issues, very eager to see the alliance move rapidly and aggressively to deal with the new deterrence challenges, and has put a lot of stock in the work that the Norwegian Institute is doing in this area. Kristin's come to this role in part because of her work at King's College in London. She's enrolled in the doctoral program as a Ph.D. candidate with a dissertation focused on civil-military relations in Russia and Russian nuclear strategy. Please join me in welcoming Kristin this morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Brad, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come here and to share some of my research, some of my thoughts on some of these issues. And I need to say then that the views presented here are my own, and they are not the official views of the of the Norwegian, not of the Russian Ministry of Defense, and not of the Norwegian Ministry of Defense either, just to make that clear. So the topic of my talk today will be the Russian deterrence concept and how I believe it has evolved in recent years. And I will argue that Russian strategic thinking, including that on nuclear weapons, has evolved beyond the notion that nuclear weapons have an elevated role in Russian strategy in order to compensate for conventional inferiority. And the theoretical debates that have been going on in Moscow now for some 15 years demonstrate an evolving Russian deterrence concept that to a larger degree take into account both conventional capabilities and non-conventional tools that can be used for deterrence purposes. So my key point will be that deterrence, not only nuclear deterrence, but a more general deterrence concept, seems now to have become central to how Russia thinks about its security in general. And in detail, what I'm going to do is firstly provide some background in order to set the stage for what seems like a comprehensive update of Russian security thinking in my mind. I'll provide the Russian definition of strategic deterrence, and I'll say a bit about its component parts, so both nuclear and non-nuclear deterrent forces, as well as non-military tools. I'll present a very simple chart displaying what is my interpretation really of this system of strategic deterrence, as they call it. And I will demonstrate excuse me, how this concept proves useful for understanding a lot of the policies that we see coming out of Moscow these days. I'll finish off by pointing to some problems that are inherent in this concept as it is currently being debated and evolved in the Russian theoretical debates. So before I delve into the concept itself, I'd like to elaborate some background on why Russia seemingly needs to upgrade their deterrent capabilities and change really their deterrence policy. The common notion since basically the late 1990s has been what I mentioned, this notion that Russia needs to compensate for conventional backwardness with their nuclear weapons. Russia's nuclear weapons and deterrence in general became essential to Russian national security throughout the 1990s, which in turn meant that for the Russians, the utility of their nuclear weapons needed to be maximized. Basically, they needed to get as much out of their nuclear weapons as possible in terms of ensuring Russian security. So this explains the first elaborations of the Russian deterrence concept that were carried out in the late 1990s. And theorists then paid close attention both to nuclear and to other types of deterrence. And then as the 2000s unfold, Russia is becoming more preoccupied with a number of security challenges that they believe directly affects them and their security. And this really is what has culminated in recent official doctrines and strategy documents such as the 2014 military doctrine and the 2015 national security concept, which both elaborate particularly three pressing challenges that Russia is now facing and that they need to deal with somehow. So the first of these issues is a perceived US military primacy, which concerns the Russians gravely. So they are preoccupied with two systems in particular, the prompt global strike concept and emerging ballistic missile defense capabilities. And this very keen concern with these capabilities is related to a Russian conviction that these degrade Russia's own nuclear deterrent capability, which is or has been then the backbone of Russian national security since the 1990s. And even though this threat is an old one that the Russians have been aware of for a long time, they seem to have become more preoccupied with it due to current US policies and also due to the current security environment. And then the second security challenge that the Russians are emphasizing these days is a newer one. This is the threat of regime change through sort of color revolution style events. Most Russian observers who debate these issues seem convinced that the kinds of regime changes that we've seen in across the Arab world and also in Russia's near abroad through color revolutions, that these kinds of events do not come about as a result of sort of indigenous revolutions. They are the product of foreign and largely Western efforts, this is the Russian perception at least, at removing leaders and regimes that they are not happy with. And so this is a much more complex and novel phenomena that Russia needs to deal with somehow. Nevertheless, this is important because it's perceived in Moscow as a security challenge and partly as a military challenge. But because this is a new type of challenge, it is only recently that Russia has started to try and formulate responses to dealing with it. And then the third challenge that Russia needs to take into account when they're formulating their military policy is the nature of modern warfare, or what they call new generation warfare. One of the primary characteristics of which is, according to Russian theorists, that this notion that military tools are less relevant in determining conflict outcomes, and that other tools, such as political, economic, informational tools, are also affecting the course of conflict. And this is sort of the main tenet of the so-called Gerasimov doctrine that you may have heard of. And so all these three security challenges have forged a revision and an adaptation of Russia's deterrent strategy and posture, including examining the role that nuclear weapons play in this deterrent posture. Russian theorists themselves have been explicit in stating that nuclear deterrence has proved inefficient in containing these kinds of threats, and that this is the reason that Russia now needs to upgrade its deterrent framework. And so such a new framework should then ideally be able to deal with all of these types of challenges and should be effective in deterring all of these kinds of threats. So this is the background against which the term or concept strategic deterrence emerges in the Russian dictionary and in the official Russian discourse. And it emerges first, as far as I have seen at least, in the 2010 military doctrine, and is elaborated in theoretical writings both before and particularly after this. And it is this proliferation of the term strategic deterrence that caused my interest in trying to figure out what it is that the Russians mean when they employ this term. And particularly the 2014 military doctrine makes use of this term, including this notion of a non-nuclear deterrence, which is highlighted for the first time in 2014 in official Russian discourse. This highlighted, in my mind, the need for a more thorough understanding of what it is that the Russians mean when they say and when they employ the term strategic deterrence. So there is a definition of this concept in the military encyclopedic dictionary of the Russian Ministry of Defense that's available on the Russian Ministry of Defense website. And I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I'm going to read parts of it. So it defines strategic deterrence as a combination of coordinated political, economic, ideological, scientific, engineering, military, and other measures taken consecutively or simultaneously to persuade an adversary that they have no chance of achieving their military or political goals by force. So as you can see from this definition, we're talking about a much broader concept than traditional nuclear deterrence. This is supposed to be a mechanism for both deterring conflict and for impacting the course of conflict through the employment of a wide range of tools, including nuclear and non-nuclear tools, military and non-military tools. And I think that there are two particular features that are interesting in this concept. Firstly, it is that it's universal in that it seems to include all the security policy tools that are available to the Russian state. and also that it aspires to the coordinated use of all of these tools. And secondly, it is continuous. It should work both in times of peace and war. So the definition states in its elaborated form that measures of strategic deterrence should be undertaken continuously. In peacetime to prevent the emergence of threats and aggression and to prevent escalation, and in wartime to hold objects to prevent escalation again, and for de-escalation. And this continuous nature, I think, blurs the line between a state of peace and a state of war. A line or a distinction that is significant for most Western policymakers. So the system of strategic deterrence seems to legitimize the use of a wide range of tools, including those that are sort of normally reserved for conflict, also in peacetime. And it is this blurred distinction in Russian policy that was what caused many Western and Ukrainian policymakers by surprise, I think, in the Ukrainian conflict. The employment of tools that are normally perceived as being reserved for a wartime, that they were employed in a period when most observers thought that we were not in a state of conflict. And moreover, due to these two features, its universality and its continuousness, defining the limits of this new Russian concept of deterrence becomes very problematic. So the Russians have, it seems, translated the language of nuclear deterrence to everyday security policy. And nuclear weapons are, for all practical purposes, but one tool within this broad toolkit. So I'm going to elaborate each component part of this concept of strategic deterrence. So first, the nuclear deterrent forces. Most analytical or theoretical treatments of this concept reiterate how Russia's nuclear deterrent forces, and particularly the strategic nuclear forces, are the mainstay of strategic deterrence, and that they will remain so for the foreseeable future. The threat of carrying out irreparable damage to the aggressor is the key task of the strategic nuclear deterrent forces, and this remains a task more or less exclusively for these forces. Although Russia has been positively disposed, as you all know, to bilateral disarmament efforts, Russia remains insistent on the deterrent effect of a broad range of nuclear capabilities. Russian arguments that an American missile defense will impact their deterrent capability, in my mind, demonstrates this insistence. Although it should be said that there does exist some debate in Russian academic circles regarding the optimal composition of the Russian nuclear arsenal. Beyond this, the Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons arsenal is relevant for the threat of inflicting unacceptable damage on the enemy and could be used to de-escalate and terminate combat actions on terms acceptable to Russia. This is elaborated then in these theoretical articles. And those kinds of formulations are retained in most of the elaborations I've read on this updated strategic deterrence concept. The modernization and upgrading of both strategic and non-strategic systems in the Russian arsenal means that Russia will ensure a wide range of deterrent options for the future, both for signaling purposes and for warfighting purposes. And the signaling part seems particularly important to this strategic deterrence framework, ensuring a wide range of tools that can be used in times of increased tension to demonstrate Russian resolve. So depending on the threat level or the perceived threat level, nuclear activity will be adjusted in order to try to decrease tensions. At least this is the theory of how this should work. And this kind of signaling can be done then through increasing training, through mobilization, through troop allocation, and through weapons dispersion. And I will say a bit more about this when I try to visualize the system as a whole. And then the second component, and the new component really of this strategic deterrence concept, are the non-nuclear deterrent forces. And these have been subject to quite a lot of debate in these theoretical writings that I've been consulting since around the year 2000. And the reason for this is that the threat of non-nuclear aggression is becoming more pressing, according to the Russian rhetoric. Russia needs the possibility, at least, of meeting these kinds of challenges symmetrically, that is, with non-nuclear responses. And implicit to this, evidently, and as I mentioned, is the conclusion that meeting conventional threats with nuclear responses is not necessarily efficient in containing these kinds of threats that have now emerged. So the military component of non-nuclear deterrent forces are conventional units and subunits equipped with strategic non-nuclear weapons on different kinds of platforms. And the purpose of these forces seems, to me at least, to be twofold. Firstly, theorists elaborate how Russia needs to create an effective deterrent against an adversary with a conventional capability for fighting a remote war. And so Russia needs a capability to strike remotely with both precision strike capabilities and the necessary auxiliary capabilities needed for such an operation, such as special operations forces, including forces for cyber operations, and air and space forces. The second purpose of these non-nuclear deterrent forces is likely to provide more options for handling a regional conflict. Some of the theorists elaborate a need to upgrade regional deterrence, that is, and I quote, the threat of the massive use of non-strategic nuclear forces and strategic non-nuclear forces in any war against Russia or her allies, the result of which might be the destruction of the participant military forces and the irreparable damage to the economy of the aggressor. Some theorists argue that the non-nuclear deterrent forces should be available at regional commands in order to constitute a more flexible response instrument than the nuclear deterrent forces. And conventional precision strike weapons could carry out similar missions to nuclear weapons, according to some of these theorists, such as demonstration strikes, limited strikes aimed at de-escalation, and to take out critical objects. So the non-nuclear deterrent forces then add numbers and weight to the types of tools Russia will have available for signaling purposes, also in times of increased tension, through, for example, exercises and training, through raising alert statuses, through moving or deploying capabilities to particular geographical areas, or for carrying out demonstration strikes. And in one way, you could say that these kinds of demonstrations are what we have seen in Syria with Russia firing sea and air-based cruise missiles from a number of different platforms, both inside and outside Europe. The non-nuclear deterrent forces should augment Russia's ability to inflict unacceptable damage on an enemy. And we can see that Russian theorists debate the value of unacceptable versus irreparable damage, highlighting how assessing what constitutes unacceptable damage will be critical to determining what tools may be most useful in different kinds of scenarios. And in this context, it's quite interesting to see mention the possible use of non-nuclear deterrent forces for de-escalatory purposes, because many Western observers would conclude or would say that cruise missiles will not be efficient in ending a conflict. It may be that the Russians have a different notion of the utility of their conventional weapons, or that they have a different notion of the kind of enemy they will be up against. But one should also remember that these non-nuclear forces include more than cruise missiles. It includes the entire range of non-nuclear capabilities at their disposal, both non-nuclear forces and also non-military tools that I will elaborate shortly. excuse me. Communicating red lines as well as what may cause retaliation are key elements of a deterrence strategy. And Russia's expanded deterrence concept is lagging somewhat in this regard. Although the non-nuclear deterrent forces that are being developed and are being displayed, although they are sort of evident to an outside observer, the mechanisms of this type of deterrence remains unclear, and it remains unclear also in these theoretical elaborations. Russian doctrine has very clear stipulations regarding nuclear weapons. They can be used when the very existence of the state is under threat. This is the formulation that's used in the Russian military doctrine. But what situations would warrant use of non-nuclear forces? That is, what specific action it is that Russia is trying to deter remains unclear in these theoretical writings and also in the official elaborations of this concept, strategic deterrence. What is pointed out in the theoretical writings is that clearer communication of intent and of what the red lines may be is needed in the future. And I would argue that this lack of clarity is even more pressing when trying to make sense of the last component of the strategic deterrence concept, that is the non-military deterrent tools. These non-military deterrent tools' primary purpose seems to be countering or helping to deter the non-military challenges that I described earlier. So the essentially political nature of the threat of externally induced regime change and the use of political and economic levers of influence in modern conflict, these are to be met then with non-military deterrence. So the political nature of these kinds of threats seems to be appreciated. The problems start really when trying to address these issues through what is essentially a military logic. So a key assumption in deterrence theory is that tools can be used to manipulate fear of costs and of consequences. And assuming that this logic can be as effective in the political and economic realms as it is when it comes to the use of force, that seems to me at least to be a bridge too far. Because while the political goals that Russia is seeking to deter are relatively clear, what is much less clear, again, is the deterrent logic, the mechanisms through which this should work. So what kind of action, and indeed whose actions, may trigger punishment, and what kind of punishment one may expect. So the severity and the certainty of punishment, a key component of deterrence strategy, is not clearly formulated when it comes to these non-military deterrent tools. But that being said, if one were to think creatively and beyond what the Russian theoretical elaborations of this concept demonstrate, one could of course envisage a certain utility also of these tools, both in trying to deter conflict and in trying to influence the outcome of conflict. Firstly, this relates to information confrontation tools, which Russia has demonstrated an aptitude for using in recent years. So these could be used to frame a conflict in the public domain, portraying one party as aggressive, or sowing seeds of uncertainty in the public debate regarding the logic of a particular conflict. It may be possible, for example, to create an informational fait accompli on the ground, either in Russia proper or in one of her neighboring states, through creating an image which frames NATO or Western action as aggression. Other information operations tools, such as offensive cyber capabilities, may be used to inflict unacceptable damage to a developed high technological society. But in order for these non-military deterrent tools to work on their own, both capabilities and intentions need to be clearly demonstrated and communicated. And so if these indeed are intended as deterrent rather than coercive capabilities, we may expect power projection activities as well as communication regarding these capabilities in the future. And then lastly, of course, one could envisage how these non-military tools could be used in combination with military tools as levers of economic, informational, or political pressure may be used to impact the course of conflict at an earlier stage of the escalation ladder than kinetic tools. And so this brings us back to the problem of determining when conflict is a fact. Moreover, non-military tools could also be used to intensify military pressure, demonstrating what some have called a cross-domain coercive capability. And the Russian hope may be that a demonstrated coercive capability in turn will instill deterrent effect. So deterrence by example, basically. But I would argue that the main purpose of these tools seems to be their deterrent utility in combination with other tools rather than their value on their own. So in order to try and make sense of this system, I have tried to make a very simple chart, and this was sort of to try and organize this concept in my own mind. So that's a disclaimer. This is my attempted systematization of the articles that I've read. This is not this is not presented in any of these articles, and this is not. I am not claiming that this is what is permanently displayed in the wall of the National Center for Defense in Moscow. And that means that some of the boxes here are elaborated and well elaborated in some of the theoretical writings, and some of the boxes are not, and so some of them have been filled in by me. So this is just a rudimentary fix to illustrate the totality of the system and how it may work. So I ask you please to not become too preoccupied with sort of the content of each and every box. So as you can see, this chart depicts the different types of tools that I've just expanded on and the roles that they may play in different stages of conflict. So in peacetime, in times of increased tension, and in war. And the details are not really the key here. I'd like to make use of this chart to make some general comments with regard to how the system may work. So the kinds of activities that we see in peacetime are all familiar. They're familiar capabilities and they're familiar activities. Perhaps with the exception of the role of special operations forces, including those conducting information operations, carrying out activities such as shaping operations, target development, and threat prevention. And that is to say, these are not unfamiliar types of activities, but they are worth mentioning as examples of the kind of activity that will be carried out regardless of whether we are in a state of peace or in a state of war. And then, in times of increased tension, and this may seem to be where we are at the moment, the concept provides for a number of options for demonstrating resolve and capability, all in order to try and convince a potential enemy of the futility of using force or of trying to pressure Russia. The problem being, of course, that all of these activities may be perceived as agitations or as escalatory, rather than as efforts to try and stabilize the military political situation. So in terms of signaling using military tools, the risks of misperception are evident. But so also, I would argue, with regard to non-military tools, the chances of misperception are really large. And one example is if one were to read a possible Russian withdrawal from the INF Treaty within this context as an effort to stabilize the situation and to try and deter conflict, then this message is clearly not being received as according to Russian intentions, at least within the context of this conceptualization. And then in wartime, Again, the capabilities and the tasks of these different tools or capabilities come across as familiar. Noteworthy, as I mentioned, is the role of non-nuclear forces also in de-escalatory missions, as well as the role of non-military tools in exerting or increasing pressure on a potential enemy in order to try and force a resolution to the conflict on terms acceptable to Russia. And again, the fact that these efforts are all contained within a deterrent framework, efforts that, or actions that we normally would understand as coercion. And I'll come back to this in my concluding remarks. So I want to reiterate this, that this is not an official representation of Russian policy. This is not a guideline for Russian policy making, as far as I know. Rather, this is a scheme that's based on some official expressions, but mostly theoretical and sort of unofficial elaborations of this concept in the Russian academic discourse. And as such, I think it's a useful way of making sense of some parts of Russian policy and also for illustrating the range of options that are becoming available for Moscow, some of which Moscow is already using. So why should we be paying attention to this? My argument is that even though this is not official Russian policy at this stage, not all of it anyway, it may be at a future point in time. And moreover, these theoretical elaborations are in fact, at least in terms of what I have seen, the best framework, or at least that can explain most of Russian policy to me. It's a better framework than a lot of other frameworks that I've looked at in terms of explaining all the different components of Russian policy, some of which are perceived by Western academics and by Western policy makers as irrational or nonsensical. So firstly, I think this concept is very useful in illuminating Russian thinking, current Russian thinking, on the impact of enhanced conventional capabilities on nuclear deterrence and on nuclear strategy. It illuminates, I believe, how conventional capabilities will take on an increasing role in Russian security policy, and that the notion that nuclear weapons are compensating for Russian conventional disadvantage, that this notion is changing somewhat. This is not to say that Russia will be ready to give up their non-strategic nuclear weapons once conventional capabilities have reached a certain level. Evidently, we see that Russia is upgrading, modernizing its entire nuclear arsenal, both non-strategic and strategic. And I would argue that Russia may and probably will still find use for the potentiality of nuclear weapons used for de-escalation purposes, as a nuclear demonstration strike, after all, is a much larger demonstration than one involving cruise missiles. But the advantage of this integrated system of a wide range of tools is the ability to adjust a potential response precisely to the threat perceived, as well as to the importance of the stakes at play. So if flexibility is what the Russians are after, then this system seems to provide a certain degree of flexibility. And secondly, where others talk about hybrid warfare or cross-domain coercion, the Russians seem to talk these days about strategic deterrence as the main mechanism through which they will defend their security interests. The comprehensive nature of this concept means that near any element of Russian security policy can actually be fitted within this system. This is a rhetorical point, really. It's on par with stating that in every military doctrine that Russia's military doctrine is essentially defensive. If all your security concerns can be dealt with within this system, then the system really is about Russian strategy, that is the use of a wide range of tools in order to reach formulated goals. So the strategic deterrence concept, in fact, makes some sense of Russian strategy as we see it unfold today. Thirdly, I would argue that the system or the concept strategic deterrence makes some more sense of some of the principles of war that Russia is emphasizing, such as asymmetry and de-escalation. The system of strategic deterrence represents the inadequacies of symmetric responses, as Russia cannot compete with potential adversaries such as the West in all domains separately. The integrated structure provides an opportunity to play to Russia's advantages, some of which have developed significantly in recent years. So I would say that this concept, this system, is a systematized asymmetric approach. Another Russian principle of war, if you will, this theory of de-escalation, also makes somewhat more sense within the strategic deterrent context, as the definition establishes how all tools, including non-nuclear forces, may be used for de-escalatory purposes. This makes, I would argue at least, that this makes the concept of de-escalation somewhat more credible, as the concept of nuclear escalation to de-escalate suffers somewhat from Buzzard's predicament regarding severity and certainty of deterrence. He says it is no good trying to overemphasize the severity if the deterrent is thereby made uncertain. And lastly, the strategic deterrent concept makes sense of some of the recent Russian communications that appear nonsensical to some Western observers. So, for example, ascertaining that Moscow may deploy nuclear weapons in Crimea seems unnecessary, as does pointing out the fact that the kinds of missiles used to take out terrorists in Syria potentially could carry nuclear warheads. However, within the system of strategic deterrence, this communication is likely intended to stabilize the military political situation, a situation which, according to Moscow, is dominated by increased tension these days. So, and so whether this is actually working is another matter entirely. My point is merely that the system actually makes sense of those kinds of statements. And then Russian adventures in both Ukraine and in Syria have enabled a demonstration and communication of a broad range of the non-nuclear capabilities that are really the novelty of this concept of strategic deterrence. And where the emphasis in Ukraine was on non-nuclear and non-military deterrent tools such as special operations and covert forces and economic, political, and informational levers of influence, the emphasis in Syria has been somewhat different. It has been on offensive and defensive air capabilities, on precision strike capabilities based on different platforms, as well as a demonstration of the ability and willingness to use military force when Russian interests are at stake. So what are the problems or the challenges with this approach in trying to extend deterrent logic as an overall framework for Russian security policy, if this is in fact what is happening? And what will be the challenges for us if this were the case? Firstly, I want to emphasize that it's not all problems. There are some parts of this concept that actually make sense, and some of it does work. Some of the new capabilities that are depicted within this deterrent framework are evidently relevant for deterring conflict and for impacting conflict. Russian conventional capabilities demonstrate a broader set of military deterrent tools to employ in times of peace and conflict. And these tools can carry out traditional deterrent tasks, such as the threat of inflicting unacceptable damage on the enemy or of targeting the enemy's ability to inflict such damage on Russia. And even some of the non-military tools that Russia is depicting, such as tools for information confrontation, may deter if a capability for example, targeting critical societal vulnerabilities or control nodes is demonstrated. So even if this concept is not fully polished, it does demonstrate to us some new elements that do make sense. And some of these are already in use, others may be used in the future. And moreover, it's clear that the point of integrating all of this into a sort of a larger system is still to try and really make use of nuclear weapons, even as they are deemed less relevant for deterring modern conflict on their own. Still, within the system, they should lend credibility to the other tools that are not as amenable to deterrent logic. That is, to instilling fear in an opponent. Nuclear saber rattling may in this way be part and parcel of the Russian ability to instill such fear in an opponent, even as their non-nuclear capabilities improve. And I will not draw conclusions as to whether this theory is really working or not. I'm just reiterating that this is the intention with expanding the deterrent concept in this way. But then there are several elements that are clearly problematic with trying to create such a sort of a comprehensive system of strategic deterrence, such as the fact that the deterrent logic itself does not hold up throughout the entire system. Political and economic instruments are not as relevant as tools for manipulating fear and can thus not really be effective in influencing behavior before they are used for coercive purposes. Moreover, the lack of a clear communication of red lines and of what kind of action will cause retaliation means that the potential adversary will likely not understand the language of this type of deterrence. And this is closely linked to the problem of communication. There is little, if any, reflection on the iterative nature of deterrence in all these theoretical elaborations that I've read. And this is disturbing as deterrence only works so far as your potential adversary understands what you're trying to communicate and subsequently reacts in the way that you predict in order for confrontation to be avoided. So issues such as provocation, arms races, escalation mechanisms are not really elaborated at all in these writings, which I think indicate a Russian preoccupation with strategic deterrence as a way of making sense of Russian policy and goals and Russian policy tools, rather than as a way of ensuring that conflict is averted. And this again entails a significant risk of misinterpretation and misrepresentation, risks that can easily create dangerous situations. And lastly, related to misinterpretation is a problem of self-deception. If the Russian leadership is convinced that its current actions are stabilizing the international situation, then this is a problem. This stems in part from the all-encompassing nature of this concept, which means that it may give an illusion that this is a system that enables you to solve pretty much any security problem, and that the world will be safer as a result of it. This logic does not hold up in the real world. Rather, it looks quite dangerous from the outside, particularly because a link to nuclear weapons is more immediate than we are comfortable with. And this means that, and I will conclude on this, that the Russian strategic deterrent concept is useful only so far. It is useful to understand Russian security policy and even to appreciate the kinds of misunderstandings that may materialize as a result of Russian efforts to try and deter conflict. But it is not necessarily useful for deterring international conflict unless a potential adversary submits to a Russian perception of how such conflicts should proceed in an orderly fashion. And that concludes my remarks. I am looking forward to your difficult questions and comments on this topic.